Hey there, Dr. Justin Marcagiani here. Welcome back to the podcast. Today we have an amazing guest, Dr. Georgia Eade, medical doctor. She's a board certified psychiatrist and she practices nutrition with a lot of her patients, which is amazing because a lot of people in her profession really haven't brought on that aspect yet. And it's such an important aspect. So I'm really excited to get her take on things. And she has a book out as well called Change Your Diet, Change Your Mind. Dr. Georgia Eade, we have her links to her website, Diagnosis Diet, and her book on Amazon will be in the description below. Dr. Georgia, welcome to the podcast. How you doing?
Thank you very much. It's really nice to be here with you, and I'm doing great. How about you?
Excellent. Thank you. So I'm always curious how patients, or I should say clinicians, go from the medical doctor, more allopathic, prescription drugs, maybe your conventional cognitive behavioral therapy background. Well, was that your background on the psychiatry side? Were you doing more like CBT stuff, talk therapy?
Medications and psychotherapy. Yep.
Okay.
A combination of both of those. Yes.
How did you make that switch? I mean, how long were you doing conventional psychiatry, prescribing SSRIs, maybe benzos, your slew of medications? How did you get to the point of like, there's got to be something more? I need to get more educated. How did that switch happen?
It happened because of my own health problems and trying to solve some of my own health problems that had cropped up in
Mm-hmm.
my early 40s. In trying to help myself with those issues, I made some rather unorthodox changes to my diet that would just through trial and error, trying to feel better. And I mean, long story short, I could certainly say more about this if you think people would be interested. But through about 6 months of trial and error changes to my diet, I kept a food and symptom journal. I was trying to address things like IBS and chronic fatigue and fibromyalgia and migraines. Um, and by the end of that 6 months, as I gradually changed my diet, I wound up with this sort of upside down diet from what we're advised to eat, and it resolved everything, not just the stomach issues, which was the original reason why I decided to try tinkering with my diet, but it resolved all of these mysterious health issues. And even though I wasn't trying to improve my mental health, I never noticed that there was much wrong with my mental health. My mental health improved too, my concentration, my mood, and my energy, and my sleep. And I thought, well, this is this diet seems to be good for the brain. And I wonder if, dietary changes could help all of my patients who aren't getting better enough, and many of whom were struggling with a lot of the same physical issues that I was, as well as mental health issues, right? But because the diet I ended up with was so unorthodox and at least seemingly unhealthy, I thought, well, I can't recommend this to my patients before I learn more about this. This diet could be dangerous, even though it makes me feel well. It was higher in fat and higher in animal foods and higher in protein and higher in cholesterol, and lower, and it didn't contain any grains, for example. So it was really more like a very low carbohydrate and ultimately ketogenic paleo style diet with
Mm-hmm.
mostly animal foods and very few plant foods. And that's based somewhat on my food sensitivities. That's not what I recommend everybody starts with, but it just got me curious about, well, why do nutrition authorities tell us to eat this other way when this way of eating seems to be so remarkably healing? So I studied nutrition. I started studying nutrition for several years, really deeply,
Mm-hmm.
independently. Even took a graduate course in nutrition at the Harvard School of Public Health. And what I learned was that most of what I thought I knew about nutrition was incorrect. And
Mm.
and then I started incorporating nutrition into my own work about 15 years ago, gradually.
That's great. Now, when you first started on this journey, was it you dealing more with the health challenge that caused you to go deeper? Or did you have experience of working with patients and feeling like your tools were a little bit limited? Maybe there's more you can offer your patients? Or was it a combination of the two? How did that unfold?
Yeah, I honestly, I think a lot of mental health practitioners are in this boat. I honestly didn't expect people to get that much better because we were taught or led to believe that mental illnesses, especially more serious mental illnesses, are chronic and mysterious and incurable. And really, the best we can do is trial and error medication management, supportive psychotherapy. And so, I mean, most of the psychiatrists that I knew, even those who'd been practicing for decades, most of our practices were filling up with people who weren't getting that much better, and that was considered completely normal.
Yeah.
So I never questioned it. I honestly never did. Um, I never had a good answer when patients would, especially patients whose lives were in really good shape, people who didn't have a lot of reason to be
Yeah.
depressed or anxious. They'd say, "Why do I want to die? I've got a good life. I don't understand." And I would say something about chemical imbalances,
Yeah.
and that maybe run in your family, and that medication is this sounds biological, and so we therapy alone is not going to be enough, and the same things that I think a lot of mental health practitioners say, because we really don't understand it. But now, I mean, this is a really exciting time
Yeah.
be a psychiatrist or mental health practitioner, of a really a health practitioner of any kind, because health practitioners of all stripes see people with mental health issues and try
All
to
the
help.
time.
All of us practice psychiatry, right?
Hmm.
So, and all of us need more solutions. So it's a really exciting time, because there's this new field of nutritional psychiatry, relatively new field of modern nutritional psychiatry that looks more at food. And then there's an even newer field within psychiatry called metabolic psychiatry, which looks at brain metabolism and how the brain produces energy, and how disruptions in the brain's energy supply can create all kinds of problems with mood and concentration and sleep and memory. So we now have much better uh, understanding of what might be driving a lot of these symptoms in the first place. We used to think of these things as chemical imbalances that have to do with things like serotonin and
Yeah.
dopamine, but now we understand that we have to look deeper. What is causing those chemical imbalances in the first place? And it turns out, just like the rest of the body, no surprise, inflammation, oxidative stress, and insulin resistance. And these three pieces, if you can address these three pieces with lifestyle, it's remarkable the improvement you can see. And if you change diet in the right ways, not the ways we're used to hearing about, but if you change them in the right ways, I mean, you can even see complete remission of even some very serious mental illnesses within a matter of weeks. It's very powerful intervention.
I love that. That's really good. So, if you kind of looked at the toolbox that you approached your typical psychiatric patients, they would come in some kind of a chronic depression, mood behavioral issue, anxiety, etc. And then your big tool belt was what? Like SSRI medications, SNRIs, benzodiazepines. What were the big drugs on your palette? Was there anything else that you were typically using kind of day in, day out?
Every day, every type of medication, everything from simpler antidepressants and anxiety medications and sleep medications, stimulants for ADHD,
Yeah. So,
antipsychotic medications,
yeah.
mood stabilizers, anticonvulsants, really every type of medication every day for really now for 25 years. I still use medications to a certain extent, but the cornerstone of my work now is nutrition.
How much do you think you've been able to reduce your prescribing habits and still get patients great results compared to before to now?
Well, the answer is a little. I have to couch that answer in by describing the practice that I have now, because
Mhm.
in 2018 I decided to launch a food first private practice. And
Mhm.
prior to that, I'd always worked in a variety of different settings: universities, colleges, hospitals, community clinics, specialty clinics. I'd worked in mixed settings where I was largely expected to prescribe medications. So when I was hired, for example, to work at Harvard University Health Services or Smith College, because I specialized in college mental health for a long time,
Mhm. Mhm.
they hired people like me, the psychiatrists who went to medical school. They hired us to prescribe medications, and they hired therapists, social workers, and and psychologists, primarily mental health counselors, to do psychotherapy. So I was hired to prescribe medications. And so I left that world in 2018. And now I only see people who want a food first approach. So
Great.
that does kind of skew my patient
Yep.
population quite a bit. But before, when I was mixing these, kind of incorporating nutrition principles into general practice in more traditional settings, for the people who were willing to try these strategies, I got better results, much better results than I had ever seen with any medication strategy. So, and that's what got me so excited about eventually moving 100% of my practice into this realm.
And did you feel like the cognitive behavioral talk therapy that you're doing, did you feel like patients responded better to that because their brains were more nourished? Maybe they had better nutrient density, blood sugar was more stabilized. Did you feel like you got a benefit from those tools that you were already using, but then you put this bolster of nutrition behind it?
Yes. So, one of the really wonderful things about improving brain health, so when you're actually treating root causes of brain health problems, you see not just, reduction in symptoms like, oh, I feel a little bit less depressed, or, I'm a little less anxious, or I can concentrate a little better. What you see is more often than not, people telling you, I feel completely well. I feel completely, I feel better than I ever have in my life.
Mm,
I never heard that from people when I prescribed medications.
mm,
And of course, when you're prescribing medications, you're prescribing side effects as well. And
exactly.
so, you really get a lot of, you have to pay a big price for the relief that you might get. I mean, most medicines do fail most people, but they do help some people. But those people who were getting some relief from medications, they were paying a price, not just paying copays, but they were paying a price with their physical health and their
Right.
emotional health, flatter mood, kind of, a dull mood,
Hmm.
sexual side effects,
Right.
dozens of pounds of weight gain, high blood sugar, type 2 diabetes. I mean, just lots and lots of side effects. So that was the price they had to pay for the relief they got. So when you prescribe nutrition interventions, you see side benefits instead of side effects, because
Right.
all of your cells appreciate being fed properly, not just your brain cells. So you start to feel better in every way. And often those benefits are even more important to people with mental health issues. Like, wow, I can't believe, it's not just that I can think more clearly, my mood is better, but I'm losing some excess weight that I've been worried about, or my blood sugar is coming into a normal range, or my headaches are gone. I have more energy. All of those things that people really value, that they didn't think that they could, that they thought they had to give up in order to feel well on medication.
That makes sense. Now, you came in as a medical doctor, so obviously you have a lot of education in biochemistry, organic chemistry, physiology, and you would think nutrition would be a staple, as a medical doctor. And even me, my doctorate's in chiropractic medicine, but even in school, you get a lot of conventional nutrition, which may deal with a lot of pathologies in nutrition, vitamin C and scurvy or beriberi and B1, but it's not really talking about, what you need to thrive optimally. And then, of course, we have big pharma and big food and their kind of unholy alliance, and then the my food pyramid, which is essentially 8 to 10 servings of grains and no really emphasis on good fats or good proteins, or if we're pushing fats, it's going to be, for a while it was the polyunsaturated oxidized omega-6 fats, right? Think of the I can't believe it's not butter spray from the 90s. So there's been this a lot of misinformation in nutrition in the medical field for a long time. I think there's also an emphasis that your medical doctor must know nutrition. They have to know it. And if they're not making a recommendation to change your diet, then it must not be a valid next step. Can you just kind of talk about how you move through your education and just realize, hey, maybe I have to update this program that I was given in medical school about what good nutrition is in regards to the food pyramid?
Yes. So I'd be very curious to hear what the nutrition education that you got in your chiropractic training was like, because in 4 years of medical school, we had maybe 2 or 3 hours worth of
Right.
nutrition education. And then 4 years of specialty training, psychiatry residency training, we didn't talk about food once.
That's
And
crazy.
so we doctors know nothing about nutrition. And I think, for patients to expect their doctors to know something about nutrition is to not realize that we don't have any education in that topic. So yeah, it's really disheartening. But you were saying, we get a lot of I mean, I had months and months and months of biochemistry. I
Right.
love biochemistry.
Right.
But, I explain in the book. I take a lot of time to explain in the book. The biochemistry that we were taught in school was fascinating because it was just lots of pathways and memorizing the names of lots of molecules,
Yep.
but never put into context of, okay, what does this mean? You
How
know,
do you apply it to your patient
how
or to
does
this
what does this mean about
inflammation? Right.
connected to the diet and connected to the health of your cells? It was just cycles and enzymes. And I
Right.
mean, I aced my biochemistry exams because I loved biochemistry, but I never understood it. I never understood why why it mattered, whether you were burning mostly carbohydrates or mostly fats, or how you
Yeah.
switch back and forth between those two things.
Right.
How food entered into those biochemical pathways. We didn't talk about that. So I explain in the book what people need to know about biochemistry, because the nutrition information, even the little bit that I was taught, was largely incorrect. So the old food pyramid, like you said, based on starchy staples and grains and
Yeah.
beans, makes no biological sense. There's no science behind it. And I have a whole chapter in the book explaining where that information comes from
Hmm.
and why we've gotten so confused about nutrition. Nutrition is actually really simple. But when you're using the wrong kind of study, which most nutrition scientists do,
Right.
when you use the wrong type of methods to study nutrition, you end up with the wrong advice. And
Right.
so I show people where that comes from, so they can decide for themselves if they agree with me that this is not a good place to look for your
Yeah.
information.
Yeah, I think a good kind of resource for the listeners just to understand how our diet recommendations came about. You can look at Gary Taubes's book, Good Calories,
Yes.
Bad Calories. He kind of looks back at some of the Senate hearings in the 70s, the George McGovern Senate hearings, where really it was special interest and lobbyist groups that wrote the nutrition recommendations, not scientists. I think that's a good starting point out of the gate to understand kind of how our food system and our general recommendations got co-opted. And then I look at nutrition and I say, well, nutrition really is applied physiology, applied biochemistry, right? That's really what it is. Now, how do you apply it, right, to a patient? So, I mean, first application we could probably look at are amino acids, right? Most of our neurotransmitters come from amino acids. And then if we break that down bigger, well, where do we get our amino acids from? We get it from good, high quality animal proteins. And then we also have to assume that we have to break those things down with good hydrochloric acid and good enzymes. So, I mean, let's start there. So, digestion, protein, amino acids, and these things can convert whether it's tryptophan to 5-HTP to serotonin, or phenylalanine to tyrosine to L-DOPA to dopamine, and then the different cofactors like B6 or methylfolate and B12. Why don't you just kind of just highlight the importance of protein, or maybe some other nutrients that you think are just so important for brain chemistry in general?
Well, clearly you know your molecules. So yes, it really is when we're talking about protein, and I explain this in the book too. When you talk about protein, what you're looking for. I mean, we when you're eating food and you're not looking for protein, you're looking for amino acids.
Hmm.
And so, because you're going to break that protein down into its individual amino acids, and then
Hmm.
you have to put them back together in the to make the molecules that the types of proteins that you need. So, I so that protein, you need to be able to digest it, you need to be able to absorb it, and then you need to be able to build it into the molecules into the proteins that you need. And in order to do that, you need lots of different types of vitamins and minerals to run those reactions. So you need healthy digestion. You need a source of protein where the protein is actually bioavailable. You need a source of protein that contains all the amino acids that you need to build the proteins that you need. If you're missing a few of those, over time it can become more difficult to build the parts that your body needs to function properly. So complete proteins from bioavailable sources, and animal foods are by far more bioavailable in most cases than most plant foods. Tofu is a notable exception.
Mhm.
And you need to be able to absorb those proteins through a healthy gut lining. And then you need to have all the vitamins and minerals available, all the essential nutrients to use those amino acids. So if any of those steps isn't working properly, you're not going to have optimal health. And those amino acids then cross the blood-brain barrier, they enter the brain, and the brain can use them, as you were saying, to make neurotransmitters, things like
Mhm.
serotonin and dopamine and norepinephrine. And so uh, your brain health really does begin with your food, uh, but it has to go through the gut to get there. And that's why gut health is so important. One of the many reasons why gut health is so important to brain health.
So really good points there. I wanted to highlight one thing. You talked about protein. Oh yeah, you talked about vegan, vegetarian kind of diet. Do you feel like a vegan, vegetarian type of diet, does it hold disadvantages in the amount of protein or the types of protein to help kind of optimal brain function regarding neurotransmitters?
I'm actually less worried about protein and amino acids than I am about some of the other
Okay.
essentially micronutrients.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
you can, uh, I have a chapter in the book called The Plant-Based Brain, which goes through the pros and cons of plant-based diets and where some
Hmm.
science comes from, what the science actually tells us about these diets. But one thing is very clear, that vegan diets are not nutritionally complete. And I think that's very
Hmm.
well known, very well established. But it goes beyond B12. And a lot of people who choose to eat a vegan diet aren't aware of that. So sometimes the nutritional deficiencies in a vegan diet are downplayed. They're not as well known or well advertised as some of the advantages are. So nutrient deficiencies is one thing, but protein, if you have the right information and you have access to the right foods, you can get all your amino acids on a vegan diet. But it can be really difficult or nearly impossible to get some of the other nutrients you need. And the ones that are most concerning are not just B12, but the correct omega-3 fatty acids,
Right.
iron, iodine, zinc. I mean, there are certain and choline. I mean, there are certain molecules that plants either don't contain at all, or don't contain enough of, or contain them in the wrong form, or mixed with anti-nutrients that make it more difficult for us to access them. So it's much harder to nourish your brain
Right.
optimally with plants only. You really need to supplement very carefully and plan your diet carefully. And so, but vegetarian diets are easier because they do include some animal foods like eggs,
Yes,
and
you can do
and there
that.
are
Helps.
some molecules there that you can get. You can. It's much easier to construct a healthy vegetarian diet.
Yeah, I think the hardest part with a vegan diet would just be unless you're adding in a good high quality like protein powder, like a pea protein or a hemp protein. If you look at most vegetarian foods, starch to protein ratio, with the exception of soy, it's about 4 times more starch, carbs than it is protein. So, if you need 100 grams of protein, you're getting 400 to 500 grams of carbs, and for most people, that could put them in an insulin resistant state. So I think, yeah, but if you get a little protein powder in there and you're emphasizing avocados, coconut oil, and healthier nuts and seeds that are maybe soaked or broken down better, then I think there is some ways to escape it a little bit for sure.
You're absolutely right. And being creative like this around people's dietary preferences is really important, because there are certainly lots of people who don't feel comfortable including animal foods in their diet, but we want them to be brain healthy too. So like I want everybody to have a seat
Mhm.
at the table. I want better mental health for everyone. And so one of the dietary patterns that I recommend in the book that are options for people are ketogenic diets. And a lot of people think of ketogenic diets, they automatically think about meat. Ketogenic diet doesn't need to contain any meat. A ketogenic diet's not about plants and animals. Ketogenic diet is a metabolic state, and it's about eating in a way that lowers your insulin levels. And
Mhm.
if you know where all those carbs are, you just need to eat a very low carbohydrate diet. And you can do that even following a vegan pattern. It's much more challenging, like you said, because of the starchy proteins, but protein powders and tofu and things like that, you can make it work. So you
Yeah.
can get the benefits of ketosis for mental health, which can be profound, even really regardless of your dietary preferences.
Right. Yeah, I think you go back to biochemistry, like one of the first things we're taught about energy and food, we're taught the Krebs cycle or the citric acid cycle. And essentially you have proteins, you have fats, and you have carbohydrates, and they're all funneling down to this compound called acetyl-CoA. And then you have, glucose has glycolysis, so you can burn glucose and get fuel right away. And most of conventional dietary recommendations seem to flow in regards to glycolysis and glucose production. And let's store your muscle full of glycogen, and that's it. But we forget about protein and fats, and then acetyl-CoA, and then we forget about how fats can go to beta or fatty acid oxidation, and we can spit these ketones off that glycerol backbone. And what you're talking about is we're talking about keeping the carbs down at a level and the fats high enough at a level, and keeping even those proteins at a good place where we can start to get this ketone fuel source. Can you talk a little bit more about how your brain runs differently off of ketones, or what that can do to your brain chemistry when we have more ketones than just pure glucose flooding into the system?
Yes. So chapter 5 in the book goes into depth about this. Hopefully, not too much depth,
Hmm.
but just for people who are interested. But yes. So really, some of the differences are when you eat in a way that lowers your insulin levels enough to turn on fat burning, and you're burning fat vigorously enough that some of that fat is going to be broken down into ketones, which are just very sort of pre-digested fat molecules, the very short bits
Hmm.
of fat essentially. And so these molecules can dissolve in the bloodstream, and they can cross the blood-brain barrier very easily, and they can fuel brain cells. And in fact, they can fuel up to about they can meet about 2/3 of your brain's energy supply. The rest of it will needs to be fueled still by glucose or blood sugar, right? So the brain is a hybrid engine, and it can run on a mixture of fuels, and actually runs more cleanly and more efficiently, with a lot less inflammation and oxidative stress if
That's
it's
it. Yep.
running on a mixture of fuels, right? So when you if you have insulin resistance, which by you I mean people that I'm talking to on
Hmm.
your program, for people out there who have insulin resistance, which is now the majority of us, those high insulin levels over the years that have been causing that insulin resistance they've also been causing insulin resistance at the blood-brain barrier, right? So the brain has become insulin resistant. The more insulin resistant you are, the more insulin resistant your brain is. And then what happens is the glucose can still waltz into the brain, no questions asked. It's the insulin that's going to have a harder and harder time crossing in. And the brain can't use glucose properly to full capacity and turn it into energy or anything else without adequate insulin. So you can have this brain swimming in a sea of glucose and still be slowly starving to death, which paves the path to Alzheimer's disease. So when you go onto a ketogenic diet, your brain, let's say your brain has got some sluggish brain glucose processing going on. It's lost some of its glucose processing capacity. And this is true for people who have insulin resistance. Their brains are not firing all cylinders. If you supplement your brain's fuel supply with ketones, you can bridge that energy gap. And you can bring these kind of sputtering, struggling cells that have just been trying to get by on not quite enough energy, you can bring them back online and feel a tremendous increase in mental clarity, in mood and energy, mental stamina, concentration, because you've revitalized parts of your brain that have slowed down over the years.
Interesting. And inflammation plays such a big role in brain health. And part of that with Alzheimer's or dementia or any of these neurological degenerative conditions, we see various plaquing in the brain, whether it's beta amyloid or tau amyloid plaque in the brain. I read a study one time, it's about a decade ago, and it was really interesting. And it just shows you how, when you have a functional medicine track versus a conventional medicine track, you think about things differently. So the enzyme in the brain, the insulin degrading enzyme in the brain, it's responsible for degrading and breaking down insulin. It's also responsible for breaking down plaque in the brain. And so if that enzyme is so busy cleaning up all the surges of insulin from all the carbohydrate, once it's done mopping up all the insulin, it doesn't have enough reserves or capacity to then clean up the plaque. And so in this science article I was reading, the scientists are talking about, yeah, we should come up with a novel drug to work on upregulating the insulin degrading enzyme. And I'm like, oh my God, like, why don't we work on getting the insulin down so that enzyme has more reserve capacity to go over here and clean up the plaque? And then what's the best intervention to get the insulin down? Dietary changes. Like, it's like the fact that that wasn't, because I think it's because you're given all these grants, you're big pharma, funded. They're like, what's the patentable drug to do it versus the free cheap thing over here? I think that's kind of the mindset, probably.
It's so true. I mean, to somebody who designs drugs, it's like somebody with a hammer. Everything looks like a nail, right?
Right.
So they have drugs, and so that's how they think. So if you're a medication-oriented person, you're going to think, what medication can I create to solve this problem?
Right.
If you're a if you're a logical person
Right.
who wants to understand the root cause and address the root cause with natural lifestyle interventions. Why is the insulin so high in the first place? What's causing this plaque buildup in the first place? I mean,
Right.
we've seen drug after drug after drug try to target amyloid that causes these plaques, and they've all failed miserably. And so, getting rid of we need to understand why the plaque built up in the first place. And
Mhm.
insulin has a lot to do with it. So,
Right.
not just the amyloid, but as you were saying, also the tau, the neurofibrillary tangles.
Yep.
So,
Yep.
those are also related to insulin deficits in the brain. And so, when you have high glucose in the brain, which you will if your blood sugar is running too high after meals, if you're eating too many of the wrong carbohydrates too often, you'll see these exaggerated spikes in glucose after meals, and those exaggerated spikes are occurring in the brain as well. So every time you get a spike in brain glucose, you get this wave, you set up this wave of inflammation and oxidative stress.
Hmm.
And then you add to that, so that's very damaging to the
Yep.
architecture of the brain, but then you add insulin resistance to that now. So what you've got is a high glucose, low insulin brain. And this is an energy deprived brain, and
Huge.
this brain will decline. And Alzheimer's doesn't happen overnight. Alzheimer's happens, it takes decades for you to lose enough glucose processing capacity for you to notice memory problems. You can have already lost up to 25% of your brain's glucose processing power before you notice memory problems. So you can never
Crazy.
change this too early.
Wow, that is crazy. Now, where does other nutrients like B vitamins or methylation come into play? Because like methylation is involving a lot of folate and B12, and we have a large percent of the population has that MTHFR mutation. So if they're consuming lots of processed grains or processed foods that have conventional folic acid in there, that can impact things. How much do these vitamins and methylation impact the brain?
I mean, it's tremendous. I mean, so this variant of the MTHFR gene is so common that a lot of people have this issue. It doesn't process folic acid. It's slow to process folic
Right.
acid. So folic acid, and it sounds like you know this very well. It's
Hmm.
a synthetic version of vitamin
Hmm.
B9. It's
Hmm.
not the version that our brains or the rest of our bodies expect to see. We expect to see folate, and that's what we are designed to handle is folate. But folic acid is now in like processed foods, in flours and cereal products, and most of the vitamin supplements, the multivitamins
Yeah.
that are in your general stores. You can find folate online, but it's hard to find. I mean, I've done this several times, walked into, say, a CVS or a Walgreens to try to find even a single supplement that contains folate, and I haven't been able to find
Yeah.
any. So folic acid is a major cause of disruption of this very beautiful cycle that's responsible for not just processing amino acids and generating, recycling B12, but also for creating neurotransmitters and creating antioxidants and fighting oxidative stress. And so this cycle, if this cycle is out of balance, all kinds of things can go wrong. And so, first do no harm, right? So take the synthetic folic acid out of your diet as much as you
Mhm.
possibly can. And if you need folate support, take actual folate. Methylfolate is what you really want.
And do you do any specific lab testing to assess that outside of like an MTHFR gene test? Do you do any organic acid testing or maybe run homocysteine or doing any other intercellular nutrients to kind of fine tune that? Let's say someone already has a good diet. Do you tweak things after the fact?
Yeah, so I test all of my patients for B12 and homocysteine and methylmalonic acid if the
Mm-hmm.
B12 is in
Yeah.
that borderline range.
Yep.
So because as you know, the cutoff levels for deficiency are set far too low.
Yeah.
So you need just a lot more B12 than the lab reports think you need. So you want really good, robust B12 levels, and you want natural sources of folate, and all of these molecules come from food, and so I'm a food first person and a nutrients when necessary person.
Mm-hmm.
So there's many different ways of practicing, but that's how I look at it anyway. But lots of people, even if you're eating really the ideal diet, whatever that might be, um, even if it, not everybody can get all their nutrients from food because some people can't absorb or process nutrients properly anymore and will need nutrient supplementation even if they're eating the best possible, most nutritious diet. So there's definitely a role for supplementation, and that's why I measure certain things to make sure that we don't need to also supplement in addition to changing the diet.
That makes sense. Now, we talked about fat earlier, and you sounds like you were more partial to kind of a paleo, kind of lower carb template dietary wise for you. And it makes sense too because go ahead. Go ahead.
Oh, no, just it depends on the person. So it depends on your
Right.
metabolic health. So if you've got really robust metabolic health, you might be able to eat fruits and starchy vegetables to your heart's content.
Right.
But if you have insulin resistance, you might need a lower carbohydrate, maybe a more moderate carbohydrate version of a paleo diet as a starting place. In my book, I recommend that people have about 90 to 100 grams of carbohydrate from whole foods as their starting point. But some people can get away with more than that.
But you feel better on a lower carb diet yourself?
I've been eating a ketogenic diet for the better part of, oh my gosh, 12 years.
You keep your carbs like around 30 to 50 net?
More like 20.
Wow. Okay, so you're just like leafy green vegetables as your carbs, and then lots of good fats and moderate proteinish.
I eat very few plants actually because I have a lot of food sensitivity. So,
Okay.
cucumbers, olives, lettuce. There are a few plants that agree with me and
Oh, great.
many that don't. So, but that's not how I don't recommend my particular diet for everyone because I have my own issues. But I help people in the book understand which foods to look at that might be problematic for them that they can then troubleshoot their diet if they're not feeling well.
Yeah, it's good to be aware of what works for you, but understand that just because that worked for me, that just shouldn't be the cut, copy, and paste for everyone. Because you
Exactly.
see that the vegan, vegetarian, they did good in this, so everyone should be this way. The carnivore guy did this, great in that. It's like, well, yeah, but why do you feel better on that? Okay, maybe I have some food thing. Maybe I'm very metabolically yeah, inflexible. I need to keep the carbs super low. This person's more of a somatotype, an ectomorph, high metabolism. Maybe they can do more carbs and starch and stuff like that. So you want to be able to figure out why someone would want that diet, right? Kind of not be as dogmatic in your recommendations.
Exactly. It's about personalization and preferences, right? So what are your personal goals? What are your dietary preferences? And what is your situation? How metabolically healthy are you? How much gut damage do you have? What are you trying to accomplish? And what are you willing to do? And so what I've done in the book is try to have a place for everybody to grab on and start where they feel most comfortable and then kind of get curious and explore and figure out what is going to work best for them. So it has to be tailored to your preferences, to your tolerances, your carbohydrate tolerance and your food tolerances, and to your lifestyle. So even if for some people, let's say for certain people, and this is true for some people, even a plant-free carnivore diet might be their best. They might feel their best on that diet, but if that's not sustainable for them because it's socially challenging or what have you, that's not going to be the right diet for them. So it's really about personalization and curiosity and just kind of a discovery mindset where you can find what's the most liberal and enjoyable diet that you can tolerate.
Yeah, and sometimes it's an 80-20 or 90-10. It's like, okay, I'm going to do this right 80% of the time, and that 20% is going to give me just enough freedom where I feel okay going back to that strictness during the week kind of thing. So I get it. It's good to figure out kind of where it works in.
Exactly.
And I've seen some data too on the mental health side because we're talking about that. I want to talk about for the raw material of the brain, being a significant amount cholesterol and fat. Yet early 80s and 90s recommendation were to cut all those things out, which is it's crazy because if like your structure had a lot of that component in there, we would say we should probably eat more of that. Like we've done that with bones and calcium and our teeth, but like how is that missed with our brain? That's one. Well, go ahead. I'll let you answer that first.
Well, first of all, I love that question because I never thought about it like that before. It's yeah, I mean, the brain is mostly fat.
Right.
Uh, so and I describe this in the book. If you wrung all the water out of the brain, you'd be
Hmm.
left with this blob that's about 60% fat,
Right.
and yet we're told that fat is bad for us. You'd also be left with a blob that has more cholesterol in it by weight than any other organ
Right.
in the body, and yet we're told cholesterol is bad for us.
It's amazing.
It's just unbelievable how illogical our dietary recommendations are. They make
It is.
no biological sense.
Yeah, there's just total contradiction after one another. And then also just looking at some of the new field of medications, the more the nuanced medications are coming down the pipeline on the psychiatric side with depression and anxiety seem to be looking at targeting inflammation in the brain. So even big pharma knows that, but we know what happens when you go after inflammation in other areas. Just go back to Vox or to the Vioxx, for instance, and the COX-2 enzyme drugs that came out in '02 and '03, and the 50 to 60,000 deaths those caused. So the problem is you may be able to target it, but at what expense? And is that enzyme they're blocking doing something else really important over here? When there's just so many things we can do naturally with omega-3s or curcumin or resveratrol, or just, of course, like the foundational diet is where everything sits on. What's your thoughts on that?
Oh yeah, I mean, uh, it's just unbelievable to me how most people are not given the simple information that they need to dramatically improve their health. And so I think that, when we're talking about superfoods and supplements and things like that, uh, and I go through this in the book because I think this is the information that most people have about brain health and what a brain healthy diet's supposed to look like is is minimally helpful at best and can be damaging at worst. So, for example, you mentioned resveratrol. So resveratrol, um, you know, they've used resveratrol studies. Wine marketers have used resveratrol studies as a reason to buy red wine,
Hmm.
but it might be a reason to buy resveratrol if you're trying to get whatever the benefits are that are claimed resveratrol has. That's very different than drinking red wine and getting those
Right.
benefits. They don't do studies with red wine. That would actually be unethical to test red wine on
Right.
people with depression and mental health problems. So, how much red wine would you have to drink in order to achieve the lowest dose of resveratrol used in those studies? 500 bottles of Pinot Noir.
Oh my
To
gosh, that's
get
crazy.
the lowest dose that's used in these
Yeah.
studies.
So
I
it's
mean,
not
I'm not
functionally
sure
possible. Yeah.
that to my patients, and there'd be malpractice, right? But the
Right.
other fascinating thing is that resveratrol is swimming in a sea of alcohol. So alcohol is a powerful promoter of oxidative stress, the very same thing you're trying to fight with that lonely little
Right.
milligram of resveratrol sitting in that bottle. So you're achieving the opposite of what you're trying to achieve. You're actually causing much more harm than good. So most of the brain health strategies that we think about it's about sprinkling superfoods on top of an unhealthy diet or nibbling around the edges of an unhealthy diet. Let's take
Yep.
just that refined carbohydrate out, the sugars, but let's leave the whole grain breads in, right? So these refined carbohydrates are good, these are bad. It makes no sense. So if you just nibble around the edges of your diet, you might get some benefit from that. It's a good place to start. But if you want real, noticeable, meaningful, life changing mental health improvements, if you want access to that potential, you have to make real big changes to your diet. You have to really fundamentally restructure it from the ground up, or all you're going to see is little bits of improvement at best.
Interesting. Very good points. Just to kind of talk about another aspect of mental health, I read a study looking at low blood sugar environments and a lot of violent crimes happening in and around these type of low blood sugar environments. And I see a lot of people that are on this processed blood sugar roller coaster. They eat a bunch of processed junky fats and carbs. Blood sugar goes up. Your pancreas makes a bunch of insulin. It goes really low. They go hypoglycemic. They're activating all these catecholamines and adrenaline, which puts them in a fight or flight state, shuts down the frontal cortex, right? Forward thinking centers of the brain. And they're in this roller coaster all day long. And then they're making all these poor decisions. And this is where you get the hangry feeling down here. Can you talk a little bit more about maybe the blood sugar roller coaster, this reactive hypoglycemia, and some of the mood issues that you see with your patients in general?
Ah, you just summed it up so perfectly because I go through all that in the book, and you just
Oh,
in a nutshell, you just it was just beautiful.
oh,
Um,
great. Thank you.
exactly what's happening. It's these catecholamines, the stress hormones, adrenaline and cortisol, and all the other hormones. It's not just blood sugar and insulin, as you
Right.
said. Insulin is not just a blood sugar regulator, it's a
Hmm.
master metabolic hormone. It is
Hmm.
controlling the activity and the levels of multiple other hormones in the body. Stress hormones ride on that roller coaster.
Hmm.
Reproductive hormones like estrogen ride on that roller coaster. Blood pressure regulating hormones like aldosterone ride on that roller coaster. And your appetite hormones ride on that roller coaster. So
Yep.
you're completely destabilized from within. And for hours, up to 6 hours at least
Hmm.
afterwards. So, one of the studies that I spell out in the book, they gave teenage boys sugar sweetened cola, glucose sweetened cola, and
Mm.
their adrenaline levels spiked by 4 to 5 times baseline
Wow.
5 hours later. And most people don't make that connection because 5 hours have gone by, and they might not realize, well, that's because of what they ate 5 hours ago. And so these are not subtle changes. And like you said, hangry. People feel like they need to eat every 2 to 3 hours. They feel
Hmm.
irritable. They can even have panic symptoms, feel very shaky, palpitations, anxiety, irritability. Most people are on this roller coaster all day long and well into the night, which can disrupt sleep. And so it's really completely destabilizing. And so if you take yourself off that roller coaster, you can get this sort of inner calm. And really, anxiety is one of the things that we see responds best to low carbohydrate diets, stabilizing that glucose roller coaster. So these are root cause interventions. Oh, I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
Sorry, I had you on mute there. You're perfect. I was talking about gluten and its connection to schizophrenia. There's been a handful of studies that have come out in the last decade or so looking at gluten and schizophrenia. I know as a psychiatrist, you had to have dealt with your fair share of those. Are you aware of any of that data, or just kind of gluten and the mental health connection as well, outside of just the carbs and the inflammation?
Yes, and so I address this in the book because it's actually a very confusing topic. I am not a fan of gluten. I'm not a fan of wheat. I'm not a fan of grains in general. I don't think they really belong in the human diet for lots and lots of reasons. But gluten in particular is fascinating because you can see these much higher levels of the gluten peptides. We don't have the enzymes in our bodies that are capable of breaking gluten down into its individual amino acids, which that alone should tell you that this is not really a human food. But in any case,
Exactly.
the those fragments, uh, those incompletely digested gluten fragments, these
Yep.
peptides, they cross into the bloodstream. They can cross into the bloodstream, especially if your gut lining is not healthy, and then your body is much more likely to create an immune reaction to them. And so you can see much higher levels of anti-gluten peptide antibodies in people with schizophrenia and in people with autism spectrum disorders, for example. So there seems to be a connection between that kind of a reaction to gluten and even for people who don't have celiac disease. We're not even talking about celiac disease, which is a very clear cut autoimmune disease related to gluten, caused by gluten. We're talking about gluten sensitivity. I have so many patients who, when they eat something with gluten in it, they feel much more depressed for the next couple of days, or they can't concentrate. But this is where it gets very complicated, because even the best studies available aren't good at teasing apart what is it in the wheat. Is it the gluten? Is it the glyphosate? Is it the lectins, the wheat germ agglutinin? What is it in the wheat that might be causing these reactions for people? It's very hard to tease that relationship apart. And so I just say, well, there's no reason to eat wheat anyway. Why risk it? It's clearly not designed for human consumption, and it's extremely low in nutrients, very high in anti-nutrients and toxins, and these indigestible proteins and these aggressive lectins. Why would you want to risk any of that? And that's why the dietary strategy that I start with in the book, for people who are willing to do this, is paleo, not Mediterranean.
Very good. Love that. I'm going to pull this study up. You probably enjoy it here as well. I think this is fascinating. So here's the study here, real quick. It's use of a gluten-free diet in schizophrenia. It's a systemic review,
Yes.
so it looks at a lot of different studies. But one case study within this was fascinating. I just thought it was amazing
Is it the
here.
one from Italy? Is it the one from Italy?
Oh, let me see here. Pull it up to the top. It is use of gluten-free diet, systemic review, Advanced Nutrition Journal 2018. Maybe it could be. It has some European sounding last names. But one paragraph I wanted to highlight that was just fascinating. If you go to this here, this is a 70-year-old patient, long-standing, right here, 70-year-old patient, long-standing schizophrenia diagnosis. It talks about what her diet looked like before: hamburger helper, macaroni cheese. Talks about her new diet down here below. Consisted of unlimited meat, eggs, 4 ounces, salad, low carbohydrate vegetables. After 1 week on a low carbohydrate diet, the patient noticed a decrease in hallucinations and overall improvement. Over the course of 12 months on this diet, the patient reported no schizophrenia recurrence of symptoms. I thought that was fascinating. It's like, wow. Like, this is why we have to start with food first. So many mental health issues can at least be stabilized. So, okay, fine, we need a medication. We're at least going to need less of those medications, right?
So I'm very familiar with this case, and this was the very first published case. This was Dr. Eric Westman, who's a colleague of
Oh, yeah.
mine
At
at Duke
Duke, right?
University.
Yep.
Yes,
Mhm.
and he was treating this woman, whose name was Doris. He was treating her for weight loss. She was wanting to lose some weight, and she had quite a bit of weight to lose. He prescribed the same simple low carbohydrate diet to her that he does for all of his patients, and lo and behold, her many decades of psychosis improved to the extent that she was able to come completely off all of her antipsychotic medications. And that was the first well-documented case in the literature. And then in 2022, I helped publish a study in France. And this was my colleague, Dr. Albert Denat, in France, a psychiatrist in France. He invited 31 of his most treatment-resistant patients with severe chronic schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and major depression to come into the hospital and try a whole foods, mildly ketogenic diet under his supervision to see if it would help them. And these were patients who were taking an average of 5 psychiatric medications, including in most cases antipsychotic medications, and who had been in treatment for an average of 10 years and weren't getting better. And so of the 28 patients who stayed on the ketogenic diet for 2 weeks or more, every single one of them improved psychiatrically and medically, metabolically, and 44% of them achieved clinical remission from their psychiatric
Wow.
diagnosis. I mean, it's just unbelievable what you can see.
That's amazing.
And it's amazing.
Now, we talk about mechanisms. You kind of postulated some, right? We know with a lot of these celiac patients or even gluten sensitive, maybe there's a malabsorption of methylation, methylated nutrients. Maybe there's an MTHFR thing, maybe low iron. Also, another postulate here is that gluten can decrease blood flow. It causes, where does it say, hypoperfusion to the frontal cortex, right? This is the area of higher thinking, problem solving, right? And if we decrease blood flow, that means we're decreasing nutrition. decreasing oxygen. If we decrease oxygen, that means oxidative stress and inflammation has to go up. So there's definitely a couple of theories. You could throw in maybe leaky gut or gut permeability and immune activation too, but there's a lot of things, and it's probably not just one thing, right? It's probably a lot of things happening at the same time.
Right. Exactly, exactly. So, when you improve your diet in ways that make sense for, from a human biology standpoint,
Mhm.
lots of things can get better. And when you're feeding yourself improperly, I mean, we've been given the wrong information about
Mhm.
food for decades and decades. So most of us have been feeding our brains improperly
Mhm.
our whole lives, and we really don't know how much better we can feel until we change the diet in these biological ways.
Love it. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Georgia. Any other questions you want to leave the listeners with, or any last statements or comments you want to leave the listeners with here?
I mean, I just, I want to let people know, like, and the reason I wrote this book was because most people with mental health issues are, especially if you think you've tried everything, I want you to know that no matter how long you've been struggling, no matter how many medications you've been taking, no matter what you've been told your diagnosis is, no matter how old you are, that if you haven't tried strategies that we now know can be very, very helpful for people. The science in this area is really exploding right now. If you haven't tried changing your diet in these ways that you may not have heard about yet, you don't know yet what's possible for
Yep.
yourself. So please keep an open mind, stay curious, don't give up. And you could be one of the people who experiences complete remission from even a very serious condition. And even if you don't have a mental health problem now, but you're worried about your future mental health, like dementia, as Dr. Justin was saying, you can dramatically reduce your risk for Alzheimer's disease if you pay attention to your glucose and insulin levels and treat that insulin resistance with dietary changes. Take the pressure off your insulin signaling system,
Hmm.
bridge that energy gap, and bring your brain back and revitalize your brain energy. These are really powerful biochemical interventions that can bring you benefits that no medication is capable of. But I also want you to know that these are powerful interventions. So please learn more about them first. Get some professional guidance about how to change your diet so that it will be safe for you to make that transition. So I've got a clinician directory that's free to search. I have a clinician training program. If you're a clinician that wants to learn how to do this, so these are really powerful intervention. So don't just change your diet tomorrow or don't just stop your medications tomorrow. Learn more about it and get some professional support. And so start there first.
And your website is diagnosisdiet.com. We'll put the link down below. And then the book is Change Your Diet, Change Your Mind, Dr. Georgia Eade. And we're going to put the links down below for everything. So don't worry about it. It's there for you. Also, this is a controversial topic. I wanted to hit it, but I've seen a lot of people that have been on medications, SSRIs, or, you even see with benzodiazepines. And I've, seen them go back to their conventional medical doctor and they've been pulled off very fast. And I think, sometimes with benzos, it needs to be even a really slower taper. What's your general protocol? And again, you need to work with your conventional doctor. This is not a recommendation. Go see your doctor. But what's your general protocol or timeline? Obviously, everyone's different for pulling someone off of a benzo or off of an SSRI. They've been on it for a long term. Are we talking 6 months, a year plus? How do you manage that?
It really is on a case by case basis, but in many cases, it needs to be a very slow
Yeah.
process. Uh, that is, you start with very small dosage reduction,
Hmm.
and then you're patient. And if you see withdrawal symptoms emerging, you go back. You go back to the previous dose and go down by an even smaller increment, and you wait. And it can take, depending on the medication, the dosage, how long you've been taking it. It can take months to a year or more to get off of some of these medications. Never, never, never stop any psychiatric medication
Hmm.
abruptly. And if you taper too fast, you can have really, in some cases, dangerous side effects, and in many cases, very uncomfortable and serious
Hmm.
side effects that will make it feel to you as though you need to stay on the medication
Hmm.
and you should never come off. In most cases, it's that you've just gone too fast. And this is where working with a really seasoned uh, practitioner who has a lot of experience
Mhm.
tapering psychiatric medications, that's really key, because if you go too fast, you will not be successful. So, and it will not be comfortable, and it may not even be safe.
Yeah, I've seen some patients come off from some prescribing psychiatrist in a month or two, and I'm like, well, that's still pretty fast. And sounds like you're talking about a single digit, 5% or so reductions every month or two while you're looking out for things. And I imagine these patients that are coming off are going to do so much better. Get healthy first, get the inflammation down, and then under watchful eye, you know what you're looking for. Then you're making these subtle changes. Does that sound like a better way to do it?
Yeah, I'm a big fan of changing one thing at a
Hmm.
time, because if you change your diet and your medications simultaneously and you
Many
start
variables.
to feel well,
Hmm.
how do you know what's causing the
Yeah, is there a
problem, or
keto
how do
flu?
you know?
Right? Yeah,
Exactly,
yeah.
exactly, exactly. And this is what I teach clinicians in the training program is, one thing at a time. So change the diet first, and then pay attention to those medications as you go along. And just it takes some skill and some, as like, you have to have some special knowledge and experience to be able to do this comfortably, but it is so worth it, because you can, in a lot of cases, you can see that people can feel better with less medication, with either a fewer number of medications or lower dosages of medications, or even able to come completely off medications or not have to start medications in the first place. So, but these dietary interventions also work well in combination with the medication. So if you don't have to have an either or approach to it, you can add the diet to the medication strategy.
Mhm.
Sometimes that's a really nice combination for certain people. So, a lot of different
Oh,
possibilities.
great. And doc, if someone wants to work with you, are you still accepting patients?
So I work in Massachusetts, licensed in Massachusetts, and if you go on the clinician directory, you'll see me listed there. I am starting to now that the book is finished, I have a little bit more room in my practice
Mhm.
to take on a few people. So I'm starting to do that here in Massachusetts. I don't have a lot of space, but send me a note and we'll see what we can do.
Great.
But there are also lots of other practitioners now who are trained to use these techniques. So if I'm not in your state, or if I'm full, or whatever the issue is, please check the directory to see if there's someone in your area that can work with you.
Awesome, Dr. Georgia. Thanks so much. Again, Dr. Georgia's links down below, diagnosisdiet.com. And we have the Amazon Change Your Diet, Change Your Mind book linked down below. All right, Dr. Georgia, thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Dr.
Take
Justin.
care.